the best gift that a parent can give to their child is their own sense of peace. I was speaking to somebody recently and I love what she said. She said, my best thing I'm going to do as a mother is lend a healthy nervous system to my child, because children are really picking up on, if you're chronically distressed and dysregulated, it actually has a huge impact on our attachment style. We can become disorganized, or we can become anxiously attached if we are chronically picking up on that kind of attunement from our parent. Do something for yourself and your own peace and your own well-being. And that will, in a busy, chaotic world, not only help you feel more stable and better as a person, but it will also have a really profoundly positive impact on your children.
Everything that we do stems back to our initial relationships with our initial family or our nuclear family and our parents. Like it or not, it's true. So welcome to today's episode of Dr. Pat Ann's podcast. And today I have an incredible guest that's going to really let us delve really deep into the meaning of those relationships and how they influence who we are today and where we're going in the future. But before we do, make sure, since I know you're going to love this podcast, make sure you comment, like, share, and subscribe to today's episode. So today's episode, our guest is a leading expert in attachment theory, which you've probably heard a lot about recently. She has a gazillion certifications, including a PhD. And she, as I said, she's the leading expert in attachment theory, and she does cutting edge research in extending the frontier of psychology with her modern day integrative attachment theory. The most exciting thing about this woman's work is that, and this is sort of kind of similar to what we're learning with DNA, we can actually change our attachment style so we are not a slave to it. So if you listen to me, I like to say our past, we are not a slave to. It just informs our future. So before we go any further, allow me to introduce our incredibly successful and accomplished guest, Thais Gibson. Did I say your name right?
Thais Gibson. That's what my grandfather used to call me, though, as a like a sweet name, Thais.
Endearment.
So
okay. Okay. All right. So thank you so much for being our guest today. But before we get into the attachment theory, because a lot of people hear a lot about that, and like most things that are pop today, there's a lot of misinformation. But before we go there, I would like you to share with the guests an experience that you've had in your life, any point in your life, that has very dramatically shaped who you are today, with the caveat, it can't be something that they'll learn about you if they were to Google you or read about you or do extensive research, something most people don't know, if not all people.
In terms of a traumatic experience that shaped me,
it could be anything, good, bad, and ugly, either one.
I do share this sometimes. I don't share this very often, but I do share this sometimes. I'm having a hard time thinking of anything other than this as like a big experience. It was traumatic, but that shaped me is, so I was addicted.
Well, a major experience for you, it doesn't have to be a major experience like, that would get you on the old Jerry Springer show, but something that was, fundamentally very, very important. If I said traumatic, I shouldn't use that word.
So I would still say the same thing. Like I actually was addicted to opiates from about just before I turned 15, after I had a knee surgery, until just before I turned 21 years old. And that
6 years.
Yeah. Yeah. And that was something that like very tremendously shaped me and the rest of my life. But what really got me out of it, I tried inpatient rehab and outpatient rehab, and I was really young. But I had a lot of like childhood trauma for sure, like a good bit of it. And I would go to AA meetings or NA meetings, and I'd see people in there and they'd be like, I'm 100 days sober and today was still such a struggle. And I'd be like 18 or 19 years old at this point, being like, oh man, I can't struggle with this for the rest of my life.
Yeah, 100 days is like forever.
Yeah. And I also was like, oh my gosh, I don't want to be like in this space where I'm just like suffering and struggling. Like it's not a way to live. And I always kind of felt intuitively like, okay, there must be a better way. I wasn't born addicted to opiates. It happened, it's a symptom of something. That's always kind of what I intuitively felt, even if I didn't have the language for it. And
Mhm.
I was still high functioning enough. Like I was in school, I go to rehab in the summer between, um,
Really?
yeah, I was trying to keep it together. And I was just
Hang on a
barely,
second. Hang on a second. I don't think most people understand or know that you can be addicted to opiates and still be functioning. So tell us a little bit about that.
yeah, I was very high functioning. I mean, I was like on the outside, though, I have to say, like definitely not
Yeah.
internally. People who were close to me were like, "Oh my gosh, what's wrong with this woman?" I was definitely I was definitely going through a lot of things, getting in trouble, all kinds of stuff. But I was in school, and so I was in school for psychology. I was always really interested in psychology. I was there, but I was really hanging on by a thread. The
Mhm.
outside of my life might have looked okay, but the inside of my life, I was really, really struggling. And I think, to be honest, I think the vast majority of people, there's a season and a chapter of life where they are functioning, right? There's sort of like these phases and chapters of when somebody's an addict. And, the first phase is often that something kind of takes you by surprise. You're way more in something than you expect it to be. You didn't expect
Mhm.
a drug to have such a hold on you. And
Mhm.
then the second season is
And a
you're
prescribed drug back then,
exactly.
prescribed drug, like, oh, Lord, what is tragedy? Yeah.
Yeah. And so, I think there's that first phase. And then there's a second phase where you are okay for a bit still. You are like a lot of people, they're still high functioning enough. Like they keep their job or they stay in school or they seem to be able to hold things down. And then there's like the rock bottom phase, which is eventually everything starts to unravel and we're
Yeah.
forced to really look at ourselves. And so, funnily enough, the really impactful experience for me was that I had somebody in a class to me, a psych class, say, "Oh, your conscious mind can outwill or overpower your subconscious mind." And I had already been really trying to get sober. I would journal, I would delete people's phone numbers from my phone that I was, getting opiates from. I would do all kinds of things. And so that to me was like, oh, this explains a lot because there was this part of me that was consciously intending get sober, stop using, change my behaviors. And subconsciously, obviously, my mind had a different set of motives. And I went on to learn that like 95 to 97% of your beliefs, thoughts, emotions, and decisions actually come from your subconscious mind and unconscious
Yeah.
mind collectively rather than your conscious mind. So it really set me on a journey of learning about the subconscious mind and trying to understand, well, why am I numbing pain? It wasn't just physical pain that I had originally been exposed to. It was like of the knee surgery, but it was that I've spent years after numbing emotional pain that I wasn't able to work through. And so I did a lot of deep work in that space on myself first. Did like a year-long certification in hypnotherapy, wanted to really understand how the subconscious mind works. And that was definitely a part of like my sobriety process and getting into a much better space for the last 14 years since.
Awesome. Well, congratulations to you because it's not an easy thing to do. Why hypnotherapy? And tell us a little bit about that. I wasn't expecting you to say hypnotherapy.
Hypnotherapy was so interesting to me because it explained the subconscious mind, right? It explained principles of suggestibility, of programming, of how we really obtain our programs and how we can change, right? Like if we look at different experiences that we have as people, I think a lot of people can relate to my experience in different forms. So, we have these experiences of you set a New Year's resolution, your conscious mind intends one thing. And then I think the statistic is something like 88% of people fail their New Year's resolution before the first week
By
is
like the
over.
third week or something, like by
Yeah.
January 21st, I think something crazy. Yeah.
Something really intense. And so it's like, well, your conscious mind is intending something, but your subconscious mind has a different set of motives. And that's really the part of us running the show. Or when we procrastinate or we sabotage something, there's no such actual thing as self-sabotage. Nobody wakes up one morning and says, I'm going to
Mhm.
sabotage my life today. It's not conscious, it's subconscious. So we have these experiences of our conscious mind intending one thing. I want to make more money, but then they spend it on, material things, or I want to stick to this goal and then they go back to eating chocolate after their New Year's
Mhm.
resolution, So we have these experiences all the time as people. And I wanted to really understand the mechanics of transformation. Like, why do some people change and some people don't? And what's happening in those very specific people? And to me, the subconscious mind provided a framework that I could understand that through the principles of neuroplasticity, reconditioning. And so that was very, very interesting to me. So that was sort of like the reason that I took that path. I found out fairly quickly that
Like an iceberg, the top is the conscious, but there's so much more underneath.
exactly, exactly. And I found out very quickly that I didn't actually love the power dynamics of hypnotizing people. Like, I didn't think it was like, it's sort of it's the teach a man to fish versus give the man a fish. It was very, you have
Mhm.
a client, they come in, they do a session, they have a transformation, they leave, they are forced to come back if they would like to get another transformation, rather than having people understand the framework of their own subconscious mind and how this is working and how it's affecting us and how we can really come to rewire those programs. And so I spent a lot of time trying to distill, while I was doing other certifications, things like CBT, are effective for some people. Cognitive behavioral therapy is effective for some people and not others. Well, what I found is when
But
you
it
can,
doesn't address the unconscious. The
yes,
CBT is so limited because it I don't even know how, I'm not so sure it's even effective. I think in and of itself, there's so many other tools that need to be employed.
yes. And so what I found is like if you could create a hybrid model of taking principles of cognitive behavioral therapy and actually overlap that with principles of suggestibility and how we actually get reprogrammed, then you have these really powerful modalities. So that's what I spent a lot of time originally doing. And when I worked with clients and went into
What do
practice.
you mean by suggestibility?
Okay, so
Tell us a little bit more about
suggestibility.
that.
Yeah, so we basically have different states
Hmm.
throughout our day, and it has a lot to do with our brain waves. So, for
Hmm.
example, if you've ever watched somebody watching television and you're trying to get their attention, and you're like, "Hey, Bob, Bob," and Bob's not listening. He's like in the television. Bob's actually in a light state of trance. And so when we're in light states of trance, we're often producing alpha brain waves. When we're in our like logical thinking, conscious mind focus mode, we're often producing more beta brain waves. When we're in very deep states of trance, times like being in hypnosis or, deep, deep states of meditation, we tend to produce more theta brain waves. So we have like different places that we become more suggestible. Interestingly enough, children generally between the ages of 0 to 8 years old, are producing predominantly alpha brainwaves. So they're in a state of hypersuggestibility. They're really sponging up all the information that's there. So when you are more suggestible, you are more easily programmed differently.
Hmm.
And basically, you are open to taking on different suggestions, ideas, emotional imprints from our experiences that basically have a greater capacity to condition us. So it's part of why we'll see children at a very young age take on so much programming, and why that programming with our caregivers at a young age is so impactful is because we're basically in this extremely um, primed state to be programmed by
Hmm.
our experiences. And of course, anything we're exposed to through repetition and emotion has the ability to recondition or reprogram the subconscious and even unconscious mind in certain cases. But generally, we're taking on the most of our foundation of programming at a very young age.
So tell me, you're using the word programming. Are you using it interchangeably with learning, or is it different?
Learning would be insight to me. So I can gain insight, right? I can say, oh, yes, I definitely have this. Let's say, for example, somebody has a core wound, a feeling not good enough, just to use a really simple one. So different
Mhm.
people have different core wounds. We can have a wound of feeling abandoned, alone, excluded, trapped.
I think every teenage girl on the planet has a core wound today.
Yes. I agree with this. And so we have these different core wounds, and we can learn that we have the core wounds. We can gain insight into them. We can say, oh, yeah, I do feel trapped. Being trapped is a big trigger for me, or I do feel not good enough. That definitely stings when that wound comes up. But there's a massive difference if we want actual transformation between learning and gaining insight versus actually reconditioning or reprogramming, which I am using interchangeably, which means actually removing that wound by leveraging principles rooted in neuroplasticity and hypnosis.
So how would you do that? Give us an example.
Okay.
I totally agree with you.
So let's do an example. There's many tools we can use to recondition, but I'll use like a very good starter one that I find people can really start and they can use at home. So let's say, for example, just for simplicity's sake, somebody has a core wound, I am not good enough. So, you know, the conscious mind speaks language. So, if I say, whatever you do not think of the chocolate chip cookie.
Or your brain can't process negative. Yeah.
Yes. And so what happens is your subconscious mind speaks in emotion and imagery. So your conscious mind says, do not. And your subconscious mind says, here's the chocolate chip cookie. And it sees it. And it may even feel a good feeling around it if you love chocolate chip cookies. The same thing happens if I were to say, okay, tell me your favorite childhood memory, right? Somebody, when they talk about their favorite childhood memory, would maybe talk about, they were playing on the playground and they would see the images of the playground and they would probably smile as they're retelling the story. So our subconscious mind is constantly being communicated with in the form of emotion and imagery, and it really has a difficult time speaking in just language. So I kind of have a bit of a problem with affirmations for that reason is, somebody can have a not good enough core wound. Nobody's waking up and saying, today I'm going to tell myself all the ways I'm not good enough. They're instead, the issue is existing at the subconscious level of mind. So if we want to change these core wounds and actually reprogram them, we have to deal with the problem we're at that, which is at the subconscious level. So now that we know that the subconscious speaks in emotion and imagery and not language, and we understand that the wound is in existence there, what we have to be able to do is we need three things to create new neural networks. We need repetition, we need emotion, and we need imagery. So it applies to the subconscious level of mind. So if we have three steps we have to reprogram. We pick the core wound and pick its opposite as step one. So I'm not good enough. I am good enough. Okay. Step two is we need 10 pieces of evidence or memory for times that we actually felt good enough. Why do we use memory? Because, like I said, favorite childhood memory, playing on the playground, every memory is actually a container for emotion and imagery. So now I'm leveraging repetition and emotion and imagery. And step three is I record this and I listen back to it for 21 days. And research shows it takes about 21 days to really reinforce new neural pathways to the point where they're strong enough. And as long as we're divesting from telling the old story of how I'm not good enough, old neural pathways tend to atrophy over time, kind of like muscles that aren't being worked out.
Right.
They atrophy. So this is called autosuggestion. It's a form of belief reprogramming. And it's very successful for people. So what we do is we take the core wound. I'm not good enough. I'm going to be abandoned. I'm going to be trapped or betrayed, and we find the opposite. We find 10 pieces of memory to oppose it. The times I felt good enough. I graduated from this school, from this program. I got this job. I showed up this way as a friend. I showed up this way as a family member. These specific memories. And then we rinse and repeat for 21 days and we get repetition.
And the person records that themselves?
Yeah,
is it audio, visual,
audio.
video?
Exactly. So record it into their phone, for example, and listen back to it for 21 days. And when you're listening to it, you want to embody it as much as possible, meaning you want to really be present with it, feel about it, and see it. Because the more that you're feeling and seeing it, the more it's really getting anchored in there.
Right. Okay. So where do you find, so 21 days sounds like, wow, that's a no-brainer if you can reprogram somebody, right, from all these horrible feelings. Where do you find the resistance comes in, right? Is it after X amount of days? Is it like, where do you see the obstacles for it? If this is known to be true, and I've heard this before, to me, it's a no-brainer. Why wouldn't you do it, right? But where do the obstacles come from?
Yeah, first obstacle I think is that people are in a place where they don't believe that they can do it. Like there's this form of like, oh yeah,
mindset.
sure. And so we have to actually be able to take a look and get motivated. Another thing is that sometimes people have a hard time sticking to 21 days, right? They're like, oh yeah, a lot of people start feeling better after day 7 or 8. And they're like, oh, I've healed the core wound. But research shows us if we really want to wire it in properly, we need at least that 21-day cycle. So, we can have resistance there. We can also have resistance to people finding memories. And they're like, I don't have any proof that
Does it have to be 10? Is 10 a magic number?
Yeah.
Why is that?
We want 10 to 15. It's just the repetition. It's the baseline of repetition that we need. Because we need that firing and wiring, right? So if we just have one, it's not really getting
the neural connection. Yeah.
In there. Exactly. So 10 is the magic number, is sort of the minimum. And then, if people are in a place where they're like, I don't want to, I don't know if it's going to work, we can kind of do a little exercise, a thought exercise where we look at the costs. What are the costs of not working on this wound? What are the costs of continuing down this path, feeling not good enough, or always believing I'm going to be abandoned, or whatever the wound is that they're working on? And what are the benefits to actually letting this wound go? What will my life look like without this wound? So we can do a little bit of a thought exercise there to really visualize that. That can create a bit of an initial emotional imprinting that will get us motivated to take action. But then we want to be looking for those pieces of evidence. If somebody's like, I don't know, I can't come up with 10 pieces of evidence, start general and then get specific. So we can ease into it, right? Where we build a little bit of emotional resonance by going, it is possible that I can improve. And then I see myself improving each day. It is possible to be good enough. I am good enough. So we can kind of do it in segments if we ever do feel resistance. And that can just make it a little bit simpler. But those are the main objections that I'll generally tend to see.
Okay, so that's so great. And I'm sure the listeners, so many people could benefit from that. What do you see? You've been doing this work for how many years now? A long time, right?
Yeah, 12 years, give or take, a little longer maybe.
Okay, so the world has really changed in 12 years.
Yeah.
How do you feel, like, what are the changes that impacts people today and their health and their wellness and all the challenges that people are facing, including the social media and, the highlight reel on TikTok is not real, right? It's somebody's highlight reel, but people think it's real. Have you seen those challenges fitting into your work, and how are you helping with that? Because it's so challenging today.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know if there's like a huge, I think at the end of the day, so I don't work in client practice anymore. I did for a long time. And then we went into content online, and now I just run programs online, through personal
Well, I'm
development.
sure you have the content online though, right?
Oh yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So it's, in one sense, having the technology of today is benefiting that because I think it makes things more accessible. When I was running a client-based practice, I was always kind of vetting clients for people who want to do the work, right? Like people who are going to show up and get invested. But I would say, like, maybe if anything, not so much with people doing the work, but in terms of challenges that exist, are challenges around social media because it affects our ability to focus, right? And the less we can focus, because we're constantly getting these new dopamine hits and distractions, and if there's always this convenience of self-soothing or self-regulating through scrolling social media rather than actually being embodied and connected to our body, we can see that some of the big challenges end up with our nervous system being more dysregulated. Interestingly enough, the less our attention span is and the more we're constantly seeking the next dopamine hit, there's a correlation, not causation, but a correlation with being more dysregulated from a nervous system point of view. We're more likely to be in kind of fight, flight, freeze, or fawn mode rather than like grounded, anchored in our body, rest and digest mode, which is obviously the optimal space that we want to be sitting in. So generally we can see that if somebody's constantly seeking and seeking convenience, distraction, rather than getting in their body, feeling their feelings, and then actually being able to be more present with themselves, they can lose out on the ability to listen to their emotions as feedback, right? And if we look at emotions as a whole, all emotions, even if we try to distract or numb from them, they're actually giving us really powerful pieces of feedback. I often say to people, there's two root causes for emotional discomfort, and they're both telling you something really important. If we have emotional pain, emotional pain will let us know we have an unmet need. If I, as somebody with a big need for emotional connection, went to live in a new country where I don't speak the language, I'm going to have an unmet need for connection, and I'm going to feel emotional pain. And that's actually a good thing because that's prodding at me to go pivot, to take action, to build new relationships, meet new friends. Emotional pain is a feedback mechanism. Then we have emotional suffering, which is the meaning we give to our emotional pain. So if I go to a new country and I have a lot of these core wounds that we were talking about, I might make it mean, oh, I don't have friends here. I feel lonely. It's because I'm disliked. It's because I'm not good enough. It's because I'm going to be abandoned and nobody cares about me, and the storytelling that we do around the emotional pain is suffering. And that's more excruciating. We feel that even more than the discomfort of the needs not being met. So when we look at emotions in and of themselves are giving us really powerful feedback that we either have an unmet need or we're beating ourselves up in our mind, and we should be mindful of it. It's trying to wake us up to that. But if we don't listen to our emotions because we're too busy distracting ourselves and numbing ourselves through external things like social media or, the next sort of dopamine hit to distract us, then we're not embodied enough and anchored enough really in our own body to be able to recognize our emotional discomfort and use it and leverage it as the feedback that it is to be able to make healthy changes. So that can definitely be a not so great vicious cycle.
Interesting. What's the most interesting person that you've helped and how throughout your career in any platform?
I mean, it's hard to say the most interesting. There's been so many like really amazing people I've worked with,
Mhm.
but I will tell one story of this wonderful girl because she's the thing I love. So she came through a personal development school and, I put out great tools and resources, but people have to show up, right? And they have to do the work.
Right.
And her story is she was actually sexually abused by her father and had a lot of trauma as a result of that, of course, and was very avoidant. Her attachment style was very avoidant. She came into her school. She originally had like a fake name,
How old was she about?
mid-20s.
Okay. Mhm.
And she came into the school. She had like a fake name, because we host these webinars, right? So we have courses and then we have webinars. So she'd come into the webinars and she'd use like a fake name and she'd be off camera. Some people come on camera, some people come off camera. And she really got into the work, like really showed up and did all the courses, really went through the work, came to every webinar. Anyway, she finally started coming in, gave her real name, started coming in, actually sharing more, eventually came on camera, started interacting with all the students, did so much healing and so much work. She actually went back to school to become a therapist. And 2 years later, ended up going through and she's now a therapist. She's a psychologist. And she's in this really beautiful place of coming in and actually helping and assisting other people. Um, after making that whole sort of career transition out of what she was originally doing. And I think it was a really beautiful testament to her to feel so healed, to be in there and doing that work.
And what did you see as the changes in the quality of her relationships based upon her healing?
Oh my goodness, like way more vulnerability, way more ability to share and be seen and heard, way more ability to actually set healthy boundaries and communicate and speak up for herself. And just a lot of ability to be like really insightful in terms of, how she was interacting with other people and what her experience and relationship to each one of these interactions was. And I would just say she's like rapidly growing all the time. So it's really beautiful to witness.
Isn't that great? You can actually watch somebody just literally change their whole lives from healing.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly.
Do you feel, and this is a subjective question, so I know it's not objective, but do you feel that there, I'm saying this jokingly, but I don't mean it jokingly. Do you feel that there's more walking wounded around today than there used to be? Or is there something else going on?
I do think there's a little bit more trauma in our world right now. I mean, I think there's a lot of factors. I think that, so how we get programmed with trauma, really, like whatever trauma truly is, it's basically something we can't emotionally process. So we give it meaning instead and we store it. Like anytime we can't process something, understand it, feel safe around it, what happens is as a means of protecting ourselves, our subconscious mind is survival oriented, right? So if you imagine somebody's walking through the forest and they see a bear on their walk to work in the morning, you know, in theory, they run away, they get away from the bear, it's fine. They have to walk the same route back to work the next day. Like they don't remember the beautiful tree next to the bear and the color of its leaves. They remember the bear's teeth, right? So we're actually
Mhm.
wired to hang on to more negative things. And so the more repetitive negative things we get, the more we're going to store it. Research shows it takes us roughly 5 positive things, research out of the Gottman Institute, 5 positive interactions to overcome one negative interaction, even just in our relationships. But we're literally wired to hang on to negative emotions significantly more as a result.
Well, it's to protect us, right? If you go way, way,
exactly.
way, way back. Yeah, the brain's really made to protect us. Yeah.
Exactly. So it's for a good reason. But unless we're actually doing work around it, I mean, we're basically programmed to be a little bit negatively oriented. And so when we look at that, it's like, you look at society right now and what's happening financially in the world, and through inflation and different challenges that are happening there. You look at what's happening to our relationships. I mean, to be perfectly honest, I think that there's a tremendous amount of power and beauty in learning to work through challenges in our relationships and learning to communicate things out, develop stable, healthy relationships. There's really powerful lessons. And when we learn to be more securely attached and rely on other people and allow other people to rely on us, it creates a sense of emotional safety in our world. And I think that because of things like dating apps and social media, we do have these strategies that get our needs met instantaneously, but that are not getting our needs met at a deep enough level for us to create this emotional sense of safety. And then I think in terms of how you look at what's happening in the media and, in so many spaces across the world politically, I mean, there's a lot more stress on people right now. And so when you look at that from a big picture point of view and you distill that down into how the macro affects the micro and vice versa, you're seeing this sort of vicious cycle of more stress happening, causing people to have to soothe in less optimal ways, which is then contributing back to the macro of more stress in the world. And wherever there's a repetition and emotion of negativity, it's going to spill out and create more trauma. Now, it may not be big T trauma, but there might be a lot of repetitive small T trauma, which again, research shows that the repeated exposure to small T trauma will in fact have similar impacts as big T trauma would have on us.
Okay, so this go wherever you want with this question. So I feel that we are but besides a huge paradigm shift today, right, with AI and all stuff, and that can be good because if we didn't have paradigm shifts, we would still, be using a flint to make fire, and we would still be riding a horse to work, right? We'd be the Industrial Revolution. But with that comes a lot of uncertainty and unsettled feelings. Okay, but what I feel we're dealing with today, and it's 2, if not 3 generations at this point, is epic parenting failure. Epic parenting failure. I mean, there's no other way to say it. Now, part of that parenting failure, I feel, is that parents are not allowing their children to fail. And I mean fail when there's very little real world consequences. So the parents have to pick the kid's teacher. They have to pick the kid's coach. They have to bully the professor for the grades. I mean, they even go on the kids' job interviews now. It's just mind blowing to me, right? And the companies are putting up with it. Now, people will say, well, I don't want my child to experience trauma. No, that's called real life failure. So I guess what I'm asking you to do is to thread that needle for me.
Yeah.
Insofar as how healthy failures, which if you want to call it trauma, people can go right ahead, but I just call it life. So how is, I'm telling you, it's a hard thing to discuss.
I agree with you. There's a big difference.
You got my point.
Difference between trauma, like big T trauma, little T trauma, even. So the trauma, let's call little T trauma something like having a covert narcissist as a parent, right? You are exposed to repetitive, manipulation, your repetitive tearing down, repetitive psychological warfare. Like those are small T traumas. They're still like a 4 or 5 out of 10 on a very regular basis. And those types of outcomes can create things like CPTSD at a root cause. But there's a big difference between actual trauma where we are exposed to extremely unhealthy or emotionally abusive circumstances versus people having to actually have the experience of growing themselves as individuals and learning things the hard way. I really believe this with all of my heart. I believe that pain is not a bad thing. Pain can be bad and it definitely can be very uncomfortable. But when we look at some of the most powerful lessons we learn, most of the most powerful lessons we learn and the biggest places that learning comes from is often through painful events and circumstances. Pain doesn't have to be trauma, right? It can be uncomfortable, but it doesn't have to be that somebody's victimized by abuse or things like that. And so I think that's a really important distinction to make. And so we can have, and even through trauma, we can learn and have profound outcomes, right? There's a beautiful body of research on post-traumatic growth and people who come out of a traumatic event having learned really powerful lessons through it, having actually healed the root cause because they're forced to address it. They actually come out more resilient, more wise, and in a much better space than they were prior to when the trauma existed. And there's an amazing body of research on post-traumatic growth to support that. But that also requires that somebody's doing that work, right? And so I think that there's these sort of two places where we have parents, and I'll be really honest here. I think parents, if they are codependent themselves, then they don't want to see their child in pain because it makes them feel uncomfortable. So as a subconscious strategy to mitigate or minimize my own pain, I'm going to prevent my child from being in pain so I don't have to suffer. And what they don't realize that they're often doing is they're preventing children from learning things the hard way, which can be very important. And they're stopping their child from individuating, which is an actually very important stage of behavioral development from teenagers turning into full-fledged adults in their adolescence.
Right. Hence all these adults, hence these young adults still financially being supported by their parents.
Yes. And listen, I do want to say that I know for people, we are in different times, generationally different times. I'm not going to sit here and give judgment to somebody who's like 20 years old, staying at home, trying to save money to buy a house. Like, I think there's,
No, I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about the kid that goes away to college, that takes out a loan, that buys Starbucks every day, that goes on spring break, and that doesn't live within their means. That's the financial reality is hard.
Yes, that doesn't learn the important lessons of what it means to manage your own money. I mean, there's really powerful lessons within that. And that's where we get into the enabling territory, is when somebody, because the parent is so focused on preventing their child from suffering, if in the process they are enabling the child to not learn their lesson, whether it's, and learn their own truth, whether it's in career or with money or in relationships or whatever it might be, then they're actually creating their child's output to end up with more trauma later on when they don't, because they're learning lessons that we would have learned slowly over time as we grew up and developed. They're learning lessons maybe in their 30s or 40s about how to manage their money, and they've learned the hard way when they have none left, or how to be in a healthy relationship, and they're learning the hard way because they never got the modeling to have to deal with conflicts with themselves or on their own. There's so many examples of this, but the moment the parent is robbing the child from learning a necessary lesson in a stage of behavioral development called individuation, as soon as that's being robbed, we have tremendous downsides there. And unfortunately, it may, in the short term, gratification wise, help the child. Long term, there tends to be a lot more negative impact. And so I think it's an important thing to keep in mind. And I don't think parents are coming at this from they know this. They're not like, oh, I'm codependent and who cares? I just don't want to suffer and see my child in pain. But I think that most people are not being educated on the impact of these decisions.
Well, I think in fairness to parents, even though I just said a harsh statement, which I stand by, the epic parenting failure, all parents, I believe, are doing the very best that they can, but we're doing this interview now at the end of March. I believe a lot of the college acceptances or rejections just came in, right? For many children, the first time they're told no is when they don't get accepted into their college of choice. It is devastating. Like the children are paralyzed. The parents are beside themselves. And that's the type of issue, to your point. Like, if the first time you hear no and you get a rejection is 18, wow, you missed the boat, and I do see that playing out for me. The most important thing, of course, is the relationship, right? Because when you get married, your spouse is not going to think you're the best thing since sliced bread after that first year. Maybe the first year they will. Then after that, life kicks in, and you know what? You're sort of kind of lazy and you should take out the garbage and, that kind of thing. Okay. So I had one more question.
May
Go
I say
ahead.
something to that point? So I do think as
Sure.
well, like you raised an important point, which is if we're not being told no, then we also miss these important lessons of like not coming at life from an entitled lens. Unfortunately, like parents who are constantly saying yes, yes, yes to everything because they're afraid of any emotional disruption of the child, unfortunately, that actually conditions and programs through repetition and emotion, like how we look at subconscious reprogramming, it actually programs in a sense of entitlement for that person. And unfortunately, to be quite honest, the more entitled we are, like life doesn't care about our entitlement, right? So the more we're actually going to feel hit very heavily by life when we're seeing things through that lens on an ongoing basis. And that's a hard lesson for people to learn, especially if it's later on in life. And the second part of it is that people actually don't learn how to self-soothe. And self-soothing is a necessity to do healthy relationships and to show up effectively in the world coming from a secure space. So if we're robbed of the lesson to self-soothe because we're not told no sometimes and have to deal with that on our own and manage our emotions, or if somebody's constantly micromanaging our emotional state for us by chronically saying yes, I mean, the damage that that does for somebody not to self-soothe, to have the sense of entitlement and then go out into the world that's not going to cater to that, that actually has extreme long-term consequences. So just, I thought that was an important thing to touch on.
No, thank you for that. Exactly. There's so much here. Yeah, I even recently, I had somebody comment about they think a lot of the parenting issues has to do with the moms working outside the home. I was like, wait, stop the presses. But she was saying that she thinks that the moms are just so exhausted. And truth be told, the women today and my coaching clients, when they have babies, they're like, okay, so what's the secret? I'm like, what secret? Because I raised 4 children. And what's the secret to being a working mom? And I laugh. It's called stress. Like there's no secret. And in the States anyway, we really haven't come that much further in helping working moms. And we're more separated from families that can help us. And I do not have the solution at all, but it is a problem. And I feel that if we had more support for families, maybe we'd be able to breathe more and be more comfortable with that child's distress if we're not always stressed. The other thing I just thought about this as well is, I was listening to Simon Sinek and he was saying, work now has become the be all for people. Like in the past, work was to paycheck. Yeah, it is what it is, right? Maybe you find your purpose, maybe you don't. Who has the time? Like, what's my why? I don't care. I need my paycheck, right? Today, people aren't involved with religion. People aren't involved in their community. Families are removed. So people are looking for much more from the workplace. So if you have an unhealthy attachment and you bring that to the workplace, I think we have a lot of the maybe mini traumas that's going on at the workplace. You want to address that at all?
Absolutely. I think there's so many interesting topics in here. So I think that, if we look at root cause, okay, I mean, I could say a lot about my real ideas around root cause, but we live in a world where right now there's more financial pressure on families, which often causes there to have to be both parents out of the home. That's more likely to actually create anxiously attached children. And like you said, there's a lot of stress on families for that. It's not easy to be able to work full time with 2 parents and raise many children at the same time. It's actually very, very difficult and extremely stressful. That doesn't even scratch the surface of what single parents are going through.
Right.
And so, there's going to be stress. And I think that there's this element of we can't change the world right now. I mean, we could definitely have the collective work to create better programs for support systems and families 100%. I think there could be so much done there. I'm not sure if I totally trust the government with the tax dollars in the first place, which is still a topic of conversation. But what can we do? Like, what's one tangible thing that we can do when we walk away from this episode, knowing that these are some of the challenges that people are facing? And I think that the best gift that a parent can give to their child is their own sense of peace. And, I was speaking to somebody recently and I love what she said. She said, she was very pregnant and about to give birth. And she said, my best thing I'm going to do as a mother is lend a healthy nervous system to my child, because children are
Mhm.
really picking up on if you're chronically distressed and dysregulated, it actually has a huge impact on our attachment style. We can become disorganized or we can become anxiously attached if we are chronically picking up on that kind of attunement from our parent. And so,
Mm.
the best gift at least a parent can give, and I really find this makes a huge difference, is even if you're stressed and you think I don't have time, when you pull into your driveway after a long day at work, meditate for 10 minutes before going inside, or have a habit where you wake up 10 minutes earlier and do something that's regulating your nervous system. Do something for yourself and your own peace and your own well-being. And that will, in a busy, chaotic world, not only help you feel more stable and better as a person, but it will also have a really positive impact on your children, because children are
So
really.
I agree with you. I agree with you 1,000%, but I can hear all the women say, myself included, back in the day, I don't even have time to go to the bathroom alone. But there has to, if they don't have the 10 minutes, there has to be some type of a transitional activity. So I didn't realize I did this at the time, but I used to pull into my driveway. I would go in the house, I would say to the kids, just let mommy get changed. I'd go upstairs. I'd go to the bathroom. I'd change my clothes, go from professional to looking like a slob or a mother. And I'm like, okay, now I'm ready. And it just allowed me to shift my role. It's not as good as meditating and all of that good stuff, but I can literally remember sitting on the toilet bowl, going to the bathroom, being like, okay, get it together. Now you're the mom, kind of thing.
Yeah.
And I do think you need to have something there.
Absolutely. And it can be things too, like things that nourish you, like people making a list of what nourishes them. And it can be things that you're doing while you're on the go. So if somebody is really interested in personal growth, make sure you listen to podcasts on your drive home, or take courses
Right.
online where you can listen to the audios, or like do things that are going to actually support you so that you're getting some kind of nourishment of your needs met, even in things like driving. But
Perfect.
I definitely would say the more we can regulate our nervous system, the better and it feels like life slows down a little bit. So for people who do have the luxury of having a spouse or a partner, it is good to say, hey, I need the 10 minutes, and then I'll go
Yep.
give you your 10 minutes. Like, see if you can create boundaries, have healthy
Mhm.
discussions, or as a worst case scenario, at least a meditative activity before you go to bed. If you can try your best when the kids have gone to sleep finally,
Mhm.
and you would do whatever you would normally do, maybe scroll through social media before bed, try to maybe supplement. You know what? I'll scroll through social media for a little and then I'll go into that sort of meditative
Perfect.
space. Yeah.
Perfect. Perfect. Okay. So I would like you to now, we're running out of time, so I don't have my other questions to ask you, but I want you to unabashedly promote yourself and your fantastic work. I want you to tell people how they can learn more about you, how they can find out more about you, how they can follow you, how they can take your courses, all of the brilliant work that you bring to the world. I want people to know how they can find it.
Well, thank you. So I put daily content out on YouTube. It's Personal Development School Thais Gibson. I also have an attachment style quiz on our website. So it's personaldevelopmentschool.com, and you can just hit attachment style quiz and it gives you a free report on like your attachment style, your wounds, some insight into how to reprogram. And then I've written 65 courses in the Personal Development School on everything related to attachment, boundaries, communication, and it's really personal development, but for your subconscious mind. So it's not just the insight learning piece, but everything is then anchored into tools for how we can actually transform. So if it's transforming our workplace relationships, our romantic relationships, our boundaries, our communication patterns, how do we apply this to the subconscious so we actually really see the needle move? And so that's personaldevelopmentschool.com as well. Lots of courses in there. And I do daily webinars with the students, myself and other members of our team. So we have all of these support groups, extra sort of dynamics in there where people can ask questions. And that's where all of the body of work lives.
All right. Well, thank you so much. This information will change people's lives. So I am so grateful that you agreed to come on to this podcast tonight. And thank you so much.
Thank you. I really enjoyed this discussion. So thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate being here.
You're welcome. And that concludes today's podcast episode of Dr. Patty Ann's podcast. Make sure you check out this beautiful woman's fantastic work in all the places that she told you about. I don't know anyone that can't use her help.